Hey guys, Richard Miller here from Miller Type Foundry. So today in this video, I'm going to be going over what's the difference between vector typography versus raster typography. So first we'll get into it. Vector typography is basically typography where it never gets pixelated. So here's a couple of some text typed out here, and this is the font Uniform Pro Condensed that I designed a couple of years ago. And as you can see, when I zoom in, no matter how far I zoom in, the text still looks smooth. You can see that curve, it never gets pixelated, it's just a really smooth curve. Even when I zoom in way far, it's just always a smooth curve no matter what. And the reason for that is because these are not pixels, these are basically a mathematical calculation. So if I expand the font, you can kind of see the way it is. You can see that when I click on stuff, there's these things called Bezier curves, and basically these calculate this curve. So if I move these points, you can see that it moves. If I mess with these Bezier curves, you can see how that affects it. So that's why it never gets pixelated no matter how far you zoom in, because it's not pixels, it's a calculation, a vector calculation of where the line should go. And you can see that here, obviously in a bold weight. This is Uniform Pro Thin, a font that I designed a few years ago that pairs with the Uniform Condensed. And basically, same thing, even though it's really thin, the further I zoom in, it never gets pixelated. If I expand it, you can see the Bezier curves, and you can see that these are just calculation. There's no pixels. That's why no matter what, no matter how far in you zoom, it never gets pixelated. And this is useful, if you're making a design that's going to be huge, on a billboard or on a, on this wrap on the side of a truck or something like that. Anything where you need it to be able to scale, no matter how far in people zoom, it's not gonna get pixelated. That's why you would use a vector typography. Now the opposite of that is raster. So this is an Adobe Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator is a program that runs off vector, and if you want, here we'll go to Photoshop, and Photoshop is a program that runs off of raster. So this is a font typed out, and this is Blunt Condensed. It's a font I designed to kind of be a alternative to Impact. Impact's used so often that it's something different. And but this is Photoshop, so Photoshop's raster based. So when I zoom in, you can start to see the pixels. And when I zoom in far, you can see all the individual pixels. This is clearly not like how the vector one was, where it's just a smooth curve no matter what. I mean, this is pixels. You can see it when you're zoomed in really far. And you can especially see how pixelated the font gets when you're using a really thin font. So this here is Tactic Sans Extended. It's a font I designed a few years ago, and this is the thin weight, as you can see. So when I zoom in really far on a thin font, it makes the pixelation look even worse. So especially if you're using a very thin font, you want to make sure you're using raster or vector appropriately for the right usage. So that's that. I mean, raster is fine if you're designing something for a computer. When I zoom out to 100%, I mean, you can't see the pixels because they're the same size as the pixel on your screen, so there's no problem there. So yeah, if you're designing something for a website, anything on the internet, anything that's going to be viewed on a computer, you can use raster type. You can do it in Photoshop, and it'll be fine. As long as your image is big enough and it's not getting blown up or anything like that, then it'll be fine. But if you're doing things for print, you want to avoid that. If you're doing a design for print, you don't want to be doing the typography in Photoshop. You want to create the image in Photoshop and then bring that into a vector program. InDesign probably be the best one. Illustrator can also be used. So I can do a demonstration of that. Here is a font that I designed a while ago called Intervogue Soft. And as you can see here, I've got the font on top of an image. So I'm combining a pixel image with text. And basically, because this is vector-based text, you can see that no matter how far in I zoom, even though this background image is becoming pixelated, the font itself is still smooth curves because that's vector based. It's not pixels, it's a calculation of where the lines are supposed to go. So that's that, and basically different file types support vector versus raster. So let's say I want to save this as a raster. So go to Save As, and I'm doing a PNG, which is a raster based image. Now you can see when I open up that image, it looks fine when it's at 100%, but because it's raster based, the more I zoom in, all of a sudden you can see that the text becomes pixelated. So like I said, if I'm using this for a banner on the internet, then it's fine because it's viewed at 100%. You know, the text, there's no issue viewing the text. If I'm doing something for print, you print this out, unless it's at 300 DPI or higher, then people are gonna be able to see the pixels if they look really close. So raster, like I said, you only want to use that if you're doing things for a computer, for the internet, things like that. If I go to save this as a PDF, now PDF is a file that can combine both a vector and raster. So I save it as a PDF, and then when we open the file, the vector file, so at 100%, these two files pretty much look the same, or look very similar. But if I start to zoom in, you can see that, look, the text is still in vector. Again, if I zoom in to the raster one, I mean, you can see the pixels very clearly. Looks very ugly up close. The vector one, no matter how far in I zoom, still smooth curves. The text is just as visible and the lines are just as crisp no matter how far in I zoom. And that's how vector works. That's the benefit of vector-based text. Typography especially is an area where if it's pixelated, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, this image, even zoomed in pretty far in this image, you can see the pixels, but because it's a photograph, the pixels are not that in your face. But I mean, anytime you have text that's pixelated, it really stands out. It really looks ugly. So just make sure, depending on what you're designing for, whether it's designing for print, designing for computer or web usage, use raster images only for computer stuff or internet stuff. Use vector for print or InDesign, where you might be able to zoom in really far and see the edges of the text. And yeah, that's the difference between vector and raster. And definitely subscribe to this channel if you like videos like this, or if you have any question about typography or graphic design, leave a comment and maybe I can help you out, make a video that would explain that for you. And I'll see you in the next video.